Hello friends, and welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only place that tells you what the numbers really mean while the rest of the world is busy applauding the orchestra on the Titanic. Today, September 17, 2025, the mainstream headlines are dripping with a cautious, almost painful optimism. UK labour market past the worst, they scream. Signs of progress, chirp the politicians. The pound even did a little happy dance. And to that, I say, congratulations. You've successfully fallen off a 100-story building, past the 50th floor, and concluded that the worst of the gravity is behind you. Folks, what we are witnessing is not a recovery. It's not even the beginning of a recovery. It's the economic equivalent of a patient's fever breaking right before multi-organ failure. We are celebrating the stabilization of a deeply, fundamentally sick economy. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this political and economic theater. We'll go from the point, the deceptive data itself, to the surface, exposing the systemic rot of policy paralysis, fiscal self-sabotage, and the terrifying ghost of stagflation that the Bank of England simply cannot exorcise. So buckle up. This is Britain's labour market paradox, why good news is the scariest news of all. Let's start with the headline numbers that have everyone patting themselves on the back. The point of the spear. The Office for National Statistics tells us that payrolls dropped by a mere 8,000 in August. This is being spun as a victory because the wizards of Wall Street, the economists surveyed by Bloomberg, had penciled in a loss of 12,000. So, we lost fewer jobs than we expected to lose. This, my friends, is the definition of grading on a curve in a failing class. It's like a surgeon telling you, good news. We only had to amputate your leg at the knee, we were expecting to go up to the hip. Let's put this victory in context. This is the 7th consecutive month of job losses. Since the Labour government's much-lauded budget in October 2024, the UK has been consistently shedding jobs. The ONS has kindly revised previous months' data to suggest the losses weren't as catastrophic as first thought. This isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign that our initial readings of the economic car crash were even more pessimistic. We're not fixing the car, we're just recounting the debris more accurately. Then there's the supposed turning of the corner in vacancies. The first increase since early 2024. Hallelujah! But let's ask the questions a real economist should ask. What kind of vacancies are these? Digging into the ancillary data, which rarely makes the headlines, reveals a troubling picture. A recent report from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, REC, shows that the growth is overwhelmingly concentrated in temporary, part-time, and gig economy roles, particularly in hospitality and logistics. Meanwhile, permanent placements in high-value sectors like finance, IT, and engineering continue to stagnate or decline. We are not creating careers. We are creating gigs. We are replacing salaried positions that come with benefits, pensions, and stability with precarious, zero-hour contracts. This isn't a sign of a robust economy retooling for the future, it's the sign of a desperate economy papering over the cracks with insecure work. It's the economic equivalent of swapping a balanced diet for a sugar rush. It feels good for a moment, but the crash is inevitable. And the pound? It extended gains. Of course, it did. The modern forex market is dominated by high-frequency trading algorithms that scan headlines for keywords like better than expected. The machine saw the headline, bought the pound, and moved on. It's a Pavlovian response, not a considered analysis of underlying economic health. That rally will last precisely as long as it takes for the market to read tomorrow's inflation report and have a full-blown panic attack. So, let's be clear. The good news is a mirage. It's a story built on low expectations, statistical revisions, and a pivot towards a low-wage, low-security labor model. That's the point. Now let's get to the surface. The real story, the one that should keep Governor Andrew Bailey awake at night, is the impossible position of the Bank of England. They are trapped in a policy cage of their own and the government's making. On one hand, you have a weakening economy. 7 months of job losses, stagnant business investment, down 1.2% year-on-year, according to the latest figures, and cratering consumer confidence. The British Chambers of Commerce's latest quarterly survey showed investment intentions at their lowest level since the 2020 pandemic. The classic central banking textbook, written in a world that no longer exists, says you cut interest rates to stimulate demand and encourage hiring. But on the other hand, you have the hydra of inflation. The monster they thought they had slain is roaring back. Let's look at the numbers. The article states inflation is expected to remain stubbornly elevated at 3.8%. This is after it peaked at over 11% in late 2022, fell through 2023 and 2024, and was supposed to be heading gracefully back to the 2% target. But it's not. It's getting sticky. This isn't just about food and energy anymore, a convenient excuse used 2 years ago. Core inflation, which strips out those volatile components, is hovering at 4.2%. The inflation is now embedded in the services sector. It's in your haircut, your car repair, your restaurant bill. This is the most dangerous kind of inflation because it's driven by domestic demand and, crucially, wages. This brings us to the Beau's central nightmare, the ghost of the wage price spiral. Wage growth, excluding bonuses, is at 4.8%. Private sector wages are up 4.7%. Now, to the average person, this sounds fantastic. Inflation is 3.8%, wages are growing at 4.8%, that's a 1% real terms pay rise. Finally, after years of falling behind, people are getting a little bit ahead, right? Wrong. At least, that's how the Bank of England sees it. To a central banker, a wage growth figure nearly 2 percentage points above what they deem compatible with their 2% inflation target, around 3%, is not a cause for celebration. It's a 5-alarm fire. They believe this is the fuel for the next wave of inflation. The logic goes like this: companies, facing higher wage bills, will protect their margins by raising their prices. Workers, seeing prices rise, will demand even higher wages in the next negotiation round. And so the spiral begins, a vicious cycle that destroyed economies in the 1970s and which central bankers have sworn a blood oath to prevent. The problem is, they are fighting this war with an outdated map. The traditional Phillips curve, the theory that there is a stable trade-off between unemployment and inflation, is broken. It's less a curve and more a Jackson Pollock painting of random data points. We now have a situation with a weakening labor market, which should cool wages, and stubbornly high wage growth and inflation simultaneously. This is the definition of a stagflationary environment: stagnant growth plus high inflation. And it leads to policy paralysis. The Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, is expected to hold rates at 4%. This is not a strategic choice. It is an act of desperation. They can't cut rates because they are terrified of unleashing the inflation beast and losing all credibility. They can't raise rates because they know it would deliver the final, killing blow to an already sputtering economy, plunging the UK into a deep and painful recession. So they do nothing. They sit on their hands, issue vague, cautious statements, and pray for a miracle, a sudden collapse in global energy prices, a productivity boom out of nowhere. They are a doctor who can't prescribe antibiotics for fear of the side effects, and can't recommend bed rest for fear the patient will die of inactivity. They are trapped. And the traders know it. The market is no longer pricing in any rate cuts for this year. The pivot is dead. Welcome to the Great Monetary Standstill of 2025. If the Bank of England is the paralyzed doctor, then the government is the chain-smoking, binge-drinking patient who keeps sneaking out of the hospital to run a marathon. The monetary policy paralysis is made infinitely worse by a series of catastrophic fiscal policy decisions. Let's be very clear about the timeline. The article notes the labor market has eased since businesses were hit by the Labour government's higher payroll taxes and minimum wage hike in April. This isn't a coincidence, it's direct cause and effect. Chancellor Rachel Reeves, facing a new hole in the public finances, a hole exacerbated by the very same high interest rates the BO is using to fight inflation, decided to plug it in the most economically damaging way possible. She raised payroll taxes. Let me explain this in the simplest terms. A payroll tax is a direct tax on jobs. It is a penalty for hiring a human being. When you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. By increasing the cost of employment, the government directly disincentivized hiring and encouraged layoffs, especially in labor-intensive small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, that formed the backbone of the British economy. Data from the Federation of Small Businesses for Q2 2025 showed that rising labor costs were cited as the number one barrier to growth for 65% of its members, a record high. On top of this, they implemented a significant hike in the minimum wage. Politically, it's a guaranteed vote winner. You're helping the lowest paid. Who could argue with that? An economist could. While a well-judged minimum wage can reduce inequality without major employment effects in a strong economy, hiking it aggressively during a period of high inflation, low growth, and squeezed corporate margins is like pouring gasoline on a fire. Businesses, particularly in retail and hospitality, are faced with a stark choice: absorb the cost and go bankrupt, raise prices and fuel inflation, which the BO is fighting, or cut staff and automate. Guess which one they're choosing? The job losses we're seeing are a direct result. This creates a fiscal and monetary doom loop. 1. The government sees a budget deficit. 2. To fill it, they raise taxes on employment, which slows down the economy and kills jobs. 3. This economic weakness should reduce inflation, but it's being counteracted by persistent supply chain issues, a lingering legacy of Brexit and global instability, and high wage demands. 4. Because inflation remains high, the Bank of England is forced to keep interest rates elevated. 5. These high interest rates increase the government's debt servicing costs, blowing a new, bigger hole in the public finances. 6. The Chancellor, now facing an even larger deficit, prepares for, you guessed it, another round of tax rises in the November 26 budget. It is a cycle of pure, unadulterated economic self-harm. The government's left hand is strangling the economy with taxes, while its right hand is demanding the central bank perform CPR. The statement from the Work and Pensions Secretary about signs of progress isn't just spin, it's a level of detachment from reality that is genuinely breathtaking. So where does this leave the UK? Let's zoom out and look at the global context. The United States, having dealt with its inflation with aggressive but decisive rate hikes, is now in a soft landing scenario, with the Fed beginning a cautious cycle of rate cuts. The US economy is growing at a respectable 2.1%. The European Central Bank, wrestling with Germany's industrial recession, is also beginning to ease policy. The UK is the outlier. It is stuck with American-style inflation and European-style stagnation. It has the worst of both worlds. The root cause of this malaise, the deep, systemic problem, is the UK's catastrophic productivity puzzle. For over a decade and a half, British productivity has flatlined. The reason the BO is so terrified of 4.8% wage growth is that it isn't being earned through greater efficiency or output. We are demanding to be paid more for producing roughly the same amount. This is the classic recipe for inflation. And why is productivity so poor? Years of underinvestment by both the public and private sectors. Chronic uncertainty following Brexit, which has decimated business investment. A tax system that, as we've seen, penalizes employment and enterprise. And an education system that is failing to deliver the high-skilled workforce needed for the economy of the future. This is the state of the UK in late 2025. It is a zombie economy. It's not dead enough to trigger a full-blown crisis and force radical, painful reform. But it is not alive enough to generate genuine growth, prosperity, and opportunity. It simply shambles on, propped up by hopeful headlines and a mountain of government debt. The good news that the labor market has passed the worst is the most dangerous message of all, because it breeds complacency. It allows the politicians and central bankers to claim their policies are working, that the pain is over, and that we can continue on this path. But this path leads nowhere. It leads to another lost decade of stagnant living standards, crumbling public services, and diminishing global relevance. So when you see the headlines celebrating this stabilization, I want you to remember what you're really looking at. You are looking at an economy on life support, where the doctors are arguing and the patient is refusing to change their lifestyle. This isn't the bottom. This is a ledge on the way down. The real crisis isn't what has happened, but what happens next when the world realizes the UK has no plan. What do you think? Is the UK trapped in a permanent state of low-growth stagflation? Or is there a way out of this policy-induced coma? Let me know in the comments below. Stay sharp, folks. And don't believe the hype.